The low-slung cabin, a hunter's shack, sagged into the earth like a forgotten thought, its roof a patchwork of tarp and corrugated tin. It squatted deep in the belly of the Appalachian foothills, miles from the nearest paved road, where the blacktop gave way to crumbling gravel and then to nothing but a deer trail slick with spring mud. Elias Vance had found it years ago, long before the change, before the war had come home to roost in his bones in a way no military occupational specialty had ever accounted for. Back then, it was just a place to get lost, to forget the roar of helicopters and the taste of desert dust. Now, it was a sanctuary, a desperate final redoubt against a world that never understood, and against the ravenous hunger that clawed at him from the inside out. He moved through the small space with the quiet economy of a man who learned to make every motion count, every breath a conscious effort. His hands, though scarred and gnarled from years of rough use and the periodic violence of his own involuntary transformations, still possessed the dexterity that had once made him a formidable demolitions expert. He brewed coffee on a Coleman stove, the hiss and pop of the propane burner the loudest sound in the pre-dawn gloom. The air, even indoors, held the damp, earthy scent of the surrounding forest, a perpetual miasma of pine needles, wet loam, and something else. Something subtly metallic and ancient that seeped from the very bedrock of the mountains. He tasted it on his tongue, a faint, coppery tang that he knew, instinctively, originated not just from his own blood, but from the earth itself. His daily rituals were simple, almost monastic. He checked the traps he had set around the cabin's perimeter, not for game, but for any sign of human intrusion. He cleaned his various hunting knives and the old hunting rifle that leaned in the corner, more for comfort than real utility. He read. He read everything, from dog-eared paperbacks on Appalachian folklore to dense, scholarly tomes on ancient civilizations and forgotten mythologies. It was a desperate, quiet search for answers, for context, for anything that illuminated the nature of the curse that had latched onto him like a hungry tick in the aftermath of a roadside bomb in some god-forsaken desert town. Lycanthropy. It was a reality that defied cheap horror novels, as real as the ache in his joints when the moon began its climb, as real as the burning thirst that seized him. The medics back at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center called it a persistent fever, a bizarre neurological trauma. They had no idea. No one did. His combat training, years spent in the harshest environments facing the worst humanity conjured, had drilled discipline into him, forged a resilience that few men possessed. He went days without sleep, subsisted on rations, endured pain beyond imagining. But it had done absolutely nothing to prepare him for this. For the gnawing sense of otherness. For the beast that snarled just beneath the surface, constantly testing the frayed edges of his control. And it had certainly not prepared him for his current job. That job began a little before dusk, when the shadows stretched long and purple across the valleys. He walked the 2.5 miles through dense woods, guided by instinct and faint, almost forgotten game trails, until the trees began to thin, giving way to a skeletal landscape of twisted rebar and crumbling concrete. This was the complex, a colossal forgotten monument to the Industrial Revolution, swallowed whole by the unforgiving appetite of the mountain itself. Once, it had been a mine, digging deep into the coal-rich veins of the Appalachians, and then, for a brief feverish period in the early 20th century, an experimental processing plant. Now it was just a shell. Its brick walls cracked like ancient pottery, its timber supports rotted through, allowing the sky to peek through gaping holes in the original roofs. Rust was everywhere, a weeping scab on every surface, lending the air a metallic, sickly sweet scent. The miasma of decay, of damp earth and dead leaves, and the slow, inevitable return of manufactured things to dust clung to him, a second skin. It was a place of lingering spirits, and not only the metaphorical kind. He moved through the upper levels with caution, his old military habit of clearing every room, checking every blind corner still ingrained. The floors were uneven, treacherous with debris, shattered glass, fallen girders, the skeletal remains of former machinery. The silence up here was profound, broken only by the drip of groundwater from the cracked ceiling or the sudden flutter of a bat dislodged from its slumber. But it was not the silence he feared. It was the other kind. The silence that spoke of depths, of things waiting, listening. Deeper still, past the collapsed mine shafts and the cavernous, echoing processing rooms, lay the true heart of his duty. He followed a narrow, almost invisible passage, a break in the rock face that appeared too natural to be man-made, yet was clearly cut with some form of impossible precision. The air grew colder, wetter, heavier. The smell of rust gave way to something else, something ancient and mineral, like wet limestone and old, dried blood. And then he was there, the dungeon. It was not a dungeon in the common sense, no medieval torture chamber with iron rings and straw-covered floors. This was something else entirely. Its architecture was primordial, horrifyingly alien. The walls were rough-hewn, torn from the very earth by some unimaginable force. Megalithic blocks of gray, unidentifiable stone, each weighing tons, fit together with an impossible precision that defied human engineering. Carved into their surfaces were symbols, not hieroglyphs or runic letters, but something far more disturbing, angular, non-Euclidean patterns that shifted and writhed in the periphery of his vision, revealing geometries the human mind was never meant to comprehend. This place breathed a prehistoric horror, a cold, vast emptiness that resonated with something not of man, not of earth, but from somewhere else, somewhere far older and far less forgiving. And here, in this suffocating maw of ancient dread, Elias Vance understood the true nature of his work. He was not just a werewolf. He was a guardian, a jailer, part of an ancient, almost forgotten order, a bloodline stretching back into the mist of forgotten eons. His lycanthropy was not just a curse, it was a birthright, a terrible inheritance. His blood possessed a unique frequency, a psychic hum that, while agony for him to maintain, actively suppressed the rage and activity of the things that slumbered and at times stirred within this primordial prison. This was no mere job. It was his inescapable obligation, his ancestral damnation. The process of his nightly transformation, which he often initiated just before entering the deepest parts of the complex, was a brutal, searing ordeal. It was not the quick, clean shift of a Hollywood movie. It was a war fought on the battlefield of his own flesh. Every fiber of his being screamed as muscle tore and reformed, bones ground and elongated, teeth sharpened into razors. His mind, the human part of it, struggled with the burgeoning animal instinct, a desperate, losing battle for control. He maintained it. He had to. Because he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that any lapse, any indulgence in the wildness, only strengthened the call from the depths, making him vulnerable, making them stronger. He began his patrol, a slow, methodical circuit of the cold, damp corridors. His heightened senses, already sharpened by his condition, were now almost unbearably acute. The faintest changes in air current, the subtle shift in the metallic tang of the air, the nearly imperceptible vibration through the stone under his paws, he noted them all. From the unimaginable depths of the dungeon, muffled sounds always reached him. Soft, wet rustles that spoke of things too many-legged to be natural. The grating scrape of something heavy and armored dragging itself across rough stone. A low, guttural breathing that filled the very air, vibrating in his chest. The creatures he guarded did not show themselves, not fully. Not yet. But they manifested in other ways, through the symphony of horror they created. He heard the quick, leathery flutter of wings, too large, too fast, just beyond a rusted, impossibly thick grate. From one cell, a perpetual cloying odor seeped, sickly sweet and reminiscent of decaying flesh, but also something else, something utterly alien and profoundly wrong. From another, a weak, rhythmic, gurgling moan echoed, not human, not animal, but something that sounded like the death throes of a nightmare given form, a sound that always made the hackles on his transformed neck rise. He was a sentinel of damnation, and his watch was eternal. Daylight, when it finally crept over the ancient peaks, offered Elias a fragile, fleeting illusion of normalcy. He spent those hours in the cabin, a world away from the echoing stone and the perpetual miasma of the dungeon. He cooked simple meals, often just a can of stew heated over the low flame of his propane stove, or a handful of dried jerky he prepared himself. The mundane smell of simmering beef and vegetables, a stark contrast to the cloying, putrid sweetness that permeated his nights. He read. Always read. Old, brittle books on forgotten mythologies, accounts of ancient civilizations, and tattered historical texts detailing the geology of the very mountains that held his terrible secret. He even studied maps, not just topographical charts of the surrounding wilderness, but strange hand-drawn schematics of the complex itself, sent to him by the shadowy council, each line a tantalizing whisper of what truly lay beneath. He tried desperately to hold on to the vestiges of his human self, to anchor himself in the known, in the mundane rhythms of daily life that felt so alien to his true existence. But the normalcy was a thin, threadbare blanket easily torn. Every sunset was a prelude, every rising moon a summons. Night transformed him, not just physically, but mentally. The tension was a constant hum beneath his skin, a static charge that never dissipated. He spent hours, even after his initial patrols, meticulously checking the traps he improvised within the complex's upper levels. Crude but effective snares and tripwires designed to alert him to any unwelcome intrusion. He ran his transformed claws along the seams of the ancient cells deep below, feeling for any new give, any fresh crack in the stone. He knew every loose bolt, every corroded hinge, every section of the enormous complex that was one breath away from collapse. He had mapped the dungeon not just in his mind, but in his very bones, an intuitive sense of its monstrous geography. He knew the dead ends, the hidden passages, and most importantly, the hot spots, the places where the activity of the things within was most pronounced, where the stone thrummed with a dark, malevolent energy. It was a grim, slow-motion chess game with death, played out in the dark, where every move, every shift of the board threatened to be his last. The sounds in the dungeon, once mere background noise, had long ago transformed into a horrifying symphony, each note a discordant assault on his sanity. There was the high-pitched wail, thin and sharp as a razor, eerily reminiscent of a child's sustained cry, a sound that always curdled his blood and raised the hair on his transformed hide. There was the low, guttural rumbling, a sound so deep it vibrated through the very bedrock, shaking the stones around him, a constant, oppressive thrumming that threatened to loosen his teeth. At times, clearer than any other sound, the distinct click and scrape of chitin came, hard and sharp, like enormous insects scuttling across stone. Though he knew whatever was making, the noise was far, far larger than any insect he had ever known. And then there was the sound he dreaded most, the one that made his primal instinct scream to retreat. A wet, slurping noise like something unimaginably large and slick slowly, deliberately, pulling its vast bulk across the damp, cold stones, leaving a trail of unseen slime in its wake. His lycanthropic blood, the very thing that made him a monster, was also his curse and his shield. It was not a passive defense, no simple barrier. It was an active, crushing mental and physical effort, a constant internal noise, a high-frequency thrum that actively drowned out the aggressive, maddening psychic presence of the creatures within. It was like holding a concrete wall in place with his bare hands perpetually. Every moment he spent in the dungeon, every second he maintained the suppressive frequency, drained him, leaving him profoundly exhausted, his nerves frayed, his transformed body aching, his mind a brittle, vulnerable thing. The very act of holding them at bay made him weaker, more susceptible to their influence, more human in his very exhaustion. At times, in the quiet hours just before dawn, when the exhaustion was at its peak, fragments of his past rose unbidden, sharp and agonizing, like shards of broken glass in his mind. Flashbacks to a life before the transformation, before the constant struggle, before the gnawing hunger. He saw his sister's kind, laughing eyes, heard his father's gruff but loving voice. He remembered the rough texture of his uniform, the camaraderie of his unit, the shared jokes and the quiet understanding. And he remembered a woman, a warmth that had once filled his empty spaces, a love that felt impossibly distant now, a dream from another life. These moments of fractured humanity served as a cruel counterpoint to his current beastly reality, amplifying the crushing sense of isolation, of being utterly alone in a world that never comprehended the horror he faced every night. He was not entirely alone. There was the Council, an ancient secret society, mentioned in the cryptic, almost illegible letters that occasionally arrived at his remote post office box, their instructions obscure poetic verses or cryptic geographical coordinates. They knew about places like this, places where the veil between worlds thinned, where things that should never be contained were kept. And they appointed guardians. Elias had received his posting, as they called it, not by choice, but by their decree, by virtue of an ancient oath woven into his very bloodline, an oath that spanned generations, passed down through whispers and the terrible, undeniable inheritance of his curse. Their letters were always brief, always vague, always unsettling. They never asked how he was, only if the containment held. It was during one such patrol, just after the full moon had begun its slow wane, when the usual cacophony of dungeon sounds abruptly shifted. He tracked the familiar, wet, slithering sound from one of the deeper cells when it cut off, replaced by a new noise, high and piercing like a whistle made from stretched skin, followed by an unnaturally long, absolute silence. Not the usual damp, cold silence of the tomb, but a profound, unnatural stillness, an absence of sound that screamed louder than any roar. Elias felt his beast instincts, usually a growling, contained thing, suddenly react, a primal tremor that ran through his core. It was a shift, an anomaly, a premonition. Something unusual was happening, something new, and it filled him with a cold dread that went deeper than his bones. The quiet, unnerving shift in the dungeon's symphony of horror was no fleeting anomaly. It was a prelude. Over the next several nights, the restlessness of the creatures within the ancient stone accelerated, a palpable tension that vibrated through the very bedrock. The cells no longer merely pulsed with their contained madness. They thrummed, a steady, low-frequency hum that set Elias's teeth on edge even in his human form. The impacts against the grates, once sporadic and desperate, became a relentless barrage, sharp, concussive blows that echoed through the subterranean labyrinth, leaving fresh, angry indentations in the impossibly thick metal. And accompanying these escalating assaults were new sounds, sharp and aggressive, unfamiliar notes in the chorus of dread, a guttural shriek he had never heard before, a frantic, clattering noise like a broken machine, and a deep, rhythmic thudding as a gargantuan entity repeatedly rammed its bulk against the unyielding stone. Elias, driven by an instinct far older than his military training, actively sought the cause of this rising tide of aggression. He moved through the cold, damp passages, his senses hyper-alert, every nerve ending tuned to the slightest deviation. His transformed claws, when he was in his beast form, traced the walls, feeling for new fissures. He found them. Fresh, angry claw marks gouged deep into the rough-hewn stone walls, stark against the ancient patina of slime and mineral deposits. Some were so deep they flayed the very rock itself. On the heavy iron bolts securing one of the more active cells, he discovered deep, fresh scratches, metallic glints against the rust, clear evidence of a sustained, furious attempt at egress. And in one particularly narrow passage, almost completely obscured by ancient debris, he found it. A shimmering, viscous trail of slime, unlike any he had seen before. It was not the usual dampness of the dungeon. This was thick, phosphorescent, and smelled faintly of ozone and something akin to burnt sugar. It indicated unusual movement, a creature using a part of the complex it had not before, or one now too agitated to care about concealment. The internal beast, a constant snarling presence beneath Elias's skin, reacted to this heightened aggression with terrifying intensity. It was not just the usual struggle for control. It was a hungry, reciprocal urge. He felt an intense itching beneath his fur, a deep, unsettling desire to join the rising chaos, to add his own roar to the chorus of confined rage. But then, almost immediately, this urge was met by a savage, desperate need to suppress it. Not just them, but himself, with a ferocity that bordered on self-destruction. The human part of him, clinging by a thread, knew that giving in to either impulse was catastrophic. Controlling the transformation, holding the beast on a leash, became a physical and mental agony, each passing hour a testament to his fading willpower. It was during one such patrol, high up in the abandoned processing plant, where the rusted metal skeletons of forgotten machinery jutted like broken teeth into the perpetual gloom, that Elias first picked up the faint, almost imperceptible signals from outside the complex. a fleeting, almost subliminal sound of a distant motor, not the familiar rumble of a logging truck on the far-off highway, but something closer, something smaller, more purposeful. Then a faint, almost invisible flicker of light, swallowed instantly by the vast, oppressive darkness of the woods. And finally, the most damning evidence, the faint, metallic tang of wood smoke, not the clean, resinous scent of pine logs burning in a hunter's hearth, but the acrid chemical smell of treated lumber, the kind used in commercially packaged firewood. This was not a stray hiker. This was not wildlife. This was people. He spent the next few hours in covert reconnaissance, using the crumbling ruins of the complex as cover, his military training taking over. He moved like a phantom through the twilight woods, silent, unseen, his senses, now fully sharpened by his wolf form, drinking in every detail. He circled the old, barely visible access road that wound through the dense foliage to the complex's perimeter. There, embedded in the soft, muddy ground, were fresh tire tracks, deep and sharp, from a vehicle much larger than a typical civilian truck, with a tread pattern he recognized from military and heavy-duty industrial vehicles. They were not random. They were deliberate. And at the old, rusting gate that marked the official entrance to the abandoned property, he found subtle but unmistakable signs of professional entry. The precise cut of bolt cutters on the ancient chain, the faint, clean pry marks on the padlock housing. This was not a bunch of kids looking for thrills. This was a targeted group. As he watched from the concealing shadows of a stand of ancient hemlocks, a fragment of an old memory, a whisper from the council's cryptic instructions, surfaced in his mind. They had warned him about the local legends. The old-timers in the nearest scattered hamlets, a good 30 miles away, spoke in hushed tones of the black heart of the mountain, of ancient evils buried deep within its unyielding rock. Others, the more adventurous, spoke of a treasure of the forgotten mine, of untold riches secreted away in its deepest veins. Elias had dismissed them as local superstitions, the idle musings of isolated mountain folk. Now a cold dread settled in his gut. He understood. These rumors, however twisted and distorted by generations of oral tradition, were leading these trespassers directly to the danger, straight to the mouth of the abyss he had sworn to guard. Returning to the perimeter, he searched more deliberately, knowing what to look for. And there, near a makeshift fire pit still faintly warm, he found the irrefutable evidence. A fresh cigarette butt, still retaining the faint scent of stale tobacco, dropped carelessly. An empty energy drink can, bright and garish against the dull forest floor, crushed and abandoned. And then, near a small pile of freshly cut branches, a fragment of a modern topographical map, folded and torn, but with one clear, damning detail: the precise coordinates of the complex, circled in red ink. This was not a random intrusion. This was not an accident. This was an invasion, and it was happening now. Elias, clinging to the ragged edges of his human form, remained hidden in the dense undergrowth, watching the group through the long telescopic lens of his old hunting scope. The light faded, painting the western sky in bruised purples and bloody oranges, but enough remained to clearly discern their composition. There were 5 of them, all men, built like stone walls, with the kind of hard, cold eyes that spoke of long nights and short tempers. Not outdoorsmen, not by the cut of their clothes or the way they moved. These were city men, thick-necked and heavily muscled, with the unmistakable bearing of men who had spent time inside, or outside the law, or both. Their leader was a lean, wiry man with a perpetual sneer etched into his face, a sharp, predatory gaze that missed nothing. He carried himself with a coiled tension, a charismatic presence that radiated ruthlessness. He was not just looking for adventure. He was possessed, Elias realized, by a singular consuming obsession. The search for whatever treasure he believed was buried deep within the mountain. They were loud, their voices carrying easily on the damp evening air, their words raw and unvarnished. Elias crouched, listening, the rich tapestry of forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the croak of a bullfrog from a nearby marsh, now secondary to the harsh, excited cadences of their conversation. They spoke of the legends in concrete terms, as if the whispers of old wives' tales constituted irrefutable blueprints to untold wealth. Gold of ancient kings, one of them grunted, his voice thick with avarice. Mystical artifacts, jewels beyond price, another chimed in, his words laced with a greedy anticipation that made Elias's stomach clench. They believed, truly madly, that beneath the crumbling industrial shell lay a king's ransom. They had no idea, not the faintest horrifying clue, of the real threat that pulsed and writhed just a few hundred feet beneath their ignorant boots. Their avarice was a blindfold, their greed a one-way ticket to damnation. A cold, hard knot tightened in Elias's gut. He knew what he must do, or rather, what his deeply ingrained code demanded he do. His old training, his deeply ingrained code of protecting the innocent, screamed at him to stalk them, to pick them off one by one, to eliminate the threat before they reached the true danger. This action, brutal as it was, presented itself as an easy path. Yet, it meant breaking his own code, the one he had lived by since his transformation. Never to shed human blood, never to succumb to the beast's instinct for human prey. To do so opened a door in his own psyche, a door he had fought tooth and claw to keep bolted shut. The alternative was to let them proceed, to allow their ignorance and greed to lead them into the maw of the dungeon. Their deaths, he considered, might sate the creatures, or at least distract them. But this choice carried an immense risk. Their blundering interference, their crude methods, carried the direct potential to breach the ancient containment, unleashing horror upon the unsuspecting world. This choice gnawed at him, a terrible, agonizing dilemma that shredded his already fragile composure. As the light faded completely and the marauders, oblivious, drew closer to the main entrance of the complex, the creatures within the dungeon sensed their proximity. Elias felt it, a profound, sickening shift in the psychic static he constantly fought to maintain. The rage from below reached a fever pitch, an overwhelming wave of pure, unadulterated fury. The roars, no longer muffled, became a deafening chorus, shaking the very earth beneath his feet, rattling the crumbling walls of the complex. He felt the pressure on the ancient containment mechanisms, the invisible chains that bound the entities within. The thin barrier he maintained was buckling, groaning under the immense weight of their collective, burgeoning madness. They smelled the fresh blood, the living warmth of the intruders, and their hunger was a tangible thing. Elias had to make a decision, and it was a terrible one. He retreated deeper into the complex, abandoning his observation post, a cold fury settling over him. He knew he could not stop them from coming in, so he focused on making it as hard as hell for them to get out. He moved with frenzied energy, a desperate choreography of survival. He activated the improvised tripwires and alarms he had set, securing them with fresh knots. He pulled up rusty metal plates from the floor, revealing deep, dark pits beneath crude but effective traps. He re-rigged collapsing sections of ceiling, setting them on hair triggers. He used his innate engineering knowledge, honed over years of military demolitions training, to reinforce the weakest points in the complex's outer shell. Jury-rigging support beams, bolting unstable sections with rusted but still sturdy eye-shaped structural beams he salvaged from the wreckage. He even planted improvised charges, small but potent at strategic choke points, hoping to delay passage collapse and funnel the intruders into his chosen kill zones. It was a desperate, last-ditch effort, a silent prayer that his efforts were enough. He paused, leaning against a cold, damp wall of what used to be a boiler room, the smell of damp ash and stale oil filling his nostrils. He knew the scale of the catastrophe that would unfold if he failed. This was not just the death of a few greedy, foolish men. This was the end of everything. If the creatures, those ancient, unspeakable things, broke free and reached the surface, known civilization, the world as he knew it, ceased to exist. All of it. The responsibility, a crushing, suffocating weight, bore down on him. It was his duty. His alone. A deep, chilling premonition settled over Elias, an icy certainty that froze his blood. He knew this night marked the turning point. He knew that regardless of the outcome, something within him broke irrevocably, lost forever. The frail, battered remnants of his humanity, the part that still clung to hope and meaning, faced profound threat. The battle began not with a roar, but with a whisper, and Elias Vance knew with bone-deep certainty he would not recognize the man or the monster who walked away from it. The first explosion ripped through the evening air like a cosmic hiccup, a sound that hammered against Elias's eardrums even through the dense stone and earth that separated him from the surface. It was a raw, concussive force, not the clean, controlled detonation of his military past, but a crude, brute force blast, a mix of unstable homemade explosives and the sheer, unadulterated power of heavy industrial equipment. The old perimeter wall, little more than a crumbled line of bricks and rusted fencing, simply disintegrated, spitting shrapnel and dust into the cooling night. The deafening roar of the blast reverberated through the entire complex, a terrifying, rolling echo that hammered through the subterranean passages, making the ancient stones groan and tremble. A fresh wave of malevolent psychic energy from the depths, agitated by the violence, slammed into Elias, making his teeth ache and his vision blur. He had already shed most of his human form, his body shifting, stretching, strengthening, his senses sharpening to a predatory edge. Now, fully in the beast, but with what felt like the last desperate flicker of his human mind still clinging to the fraying edges of his consciousness, Elias moved. He was a shadow, a whisper of motion in the perpetual gloom of the upper levels, silent as the grave. He stalked the marauders from the fringes, observing their crude, impatient advance. The darkness, a blinding force for a human, was his ally, a second skin. He knew every collapsed section, every hidden culvert, every precarious shortcut, moving through the labyrinthine ruins like a wraith, studying their tactics, their vulnerabilities, the brutal efficiency of their tools. They poured into the complex, their high-powered flashlights cutting harsh, anemic beams through the dust-choked air. At first they found only ruin, a vast echoing space of mangled metal and crumbling masonry, reeking of decay and damp earth. Their initial disappointment was palpable, a collective grunt of frustration. It quickly morphed into a reckless, destructive fury. No carefully planned search. They simply began to smash and topple whatever stood in their way, using crowbars and hydraulic jacks to tear apart rusted machinery. Convinced that the treasures were hidden behind false walls or beneath the collapsed floors, the sounds of splintering wood and groaning metal joined the lingering echoes of the explosion, a cacophony of pointless destruction. And then they found it. The main gate to the dungeon. It was not just a door. It was a colossal, monolithic slab of gray, unidentifiable stone, thicker than any man was tall, set into an archway that had been carved by the hand of some furious god. It was sealed not with modern locks, but with ancient, impossibly thick iron bolts, their surfaces corroded by millennia of damp, but still holding fast. Runes. The same alien, non-Euclidean symbols Elias knew from the dungeon's deeper parts, were carved deep into its surface, glowing faintly with an inner preternatural light when the flashlights played across them. The marauder's eyes, even through the grimy haze, gleamed with renewed, almost feverish avarice. This was it. This was the vault. They were absolutely convinced that beyond this ancient, formidable barrier lay the promised gold, the mystical artifacts, the untold riches of forgotten kings. The moment the marauders began their assault on the gate, their pickaxes ringing against the impossible stone, their explosives being rigged into the cracks, the creatures within the dungeon erupted into an absolute frenzy. It was not just a roar anymore. It was an ear-splitting, mind-shattering, unified chorus of pure, unbridled insanity. Their screams and their desperate thudding impacts against their cells merged into a single, overwhelming wave of sound, so loud, so primal, that it felt as though it tore Elias's very sanity into shreds. The air vibrated with their collective madness, a tangible pressure that imploded his skull. They felt the proximity of their liberation, the tantalizing scent of fresh meat beyond their prison. Elias felt it too, an almost irresistible, consuming desire to tear the marauders limb from limb, right there, right then, to silence their ignorant clamor and punish their foolish intrusion. The beast's rage, usually a simmering, contained inferno, surged hot and blinding, threatening to overwhelm the last vestige of his human mind. He tasted the metallic tang of blood on his tongue, felt the involuntary tremor of his claws extending, but he clung to the remnants of control with a desperate, white-knuckled grip, knowing with chilling clarity that a premature intervention, a visible display of his own monstrous nature, led to an even greater catastrophe. It confused the creatures, directed their fury towards him, or caused them to shift their desperate escape attempts to other, weaker points he had not been able to secure. He had to wait. He was caught in an impossible dilemma. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to eliminate the threat, but every rational thought, every calculation, told him to hold back. He had hoped foolishly that the complex's natural hazards, its treacherous floors and hidden pits, deterred them, or forced them to retreat. He had planned for them to get lost, to give up, to stumble away in frustration or fear. He had given them the opportunity to retreat, to save themselves from their own colossal ignorance. He had drastically underestimated their desperation, their single-minded avarice, their sheer, pig-headed insistence. And that, he realized as the first crack appeared in the monolithic gate, was his fatal error. The constant, deafening assault from within the dungeon, amplified by the clamor of the marauders' breaching efforts above, was a relentless hammer blow to Elias's mind. His human consciousness, the fragile shell he desperately clung to, was on the very brink of collapse. The combined mental pressure of the imprisoned monsters, their rage a palpable force pushing against his psychic barrier, coupled with the raw proximity of the human intruders, and the escalating fury of his own contained beast, was tearing him apart from the inside out. He felt like a ship in a hurricane, sails ripped to shreds, hull groaning, taking on water, sinking. He began to see things, distorted, shifting reflections of himself in the unseen eyes of the monsters, in the patterns of slime on the walls, in the very shadows that clung to the ancient stone. He heard their voices too, a cacophony of chitters and growls and slithering sounds that wove themselves into his own thoughts. A horrifying, multi-voiced internal monologue that whispered promises of power, of freedom, of unspeakable delights. The distinction between himself and them, between the guardian and the guarded, became a terrifyingly blurred line. Was he already one of them? Was he merely a monster that had not yet reached its final grotesque form, still clinging to a past that was no longer real? A terrible, cold solidarity began to settle over him, a shared understanding of their confinement, their craving for the open air, the scent of the living world. A chilling thought, cold as the dungeon's ancient stones began to take root. Was he, in his current state, just a slightly better contained version of what lay beyond the bars? He knew the answer, even as he fought it. He was a vessel, a temporary, tormented container for a power that was slowly, inevitably transforming him. He was becoming, by degrees, the very thing he fought. He began to feel a deep, unsettling empathy with their desire to escape, to be free. What right did he, a monster himself, have to deny them their liberty? In the growing chaos of his mind, fragments of ancient tales, passed down to him through the council's cryptic instructions and whispered through the generations of his family's bloodline, began to surface with terrifying clarity. Stories of the fallen guardians. Those few, and indeed more than a few, who had not been strong enough or had proven too strong to bear the unbearable burden. Those who had succumbed to the constant psychic assault had been consumed by the darkness they were sworn to contain. They had not died, not truly. They had been absorbed, transformed, becoming part of the very things they had guarded. Their essence, twisted and malevolent, became another layer in the torment of the dungeon, another monstrous intelligence trapped within its confines. He watched his own future unfold before him. The struggle, both internal and external, began to manifest physically. Uncontrollable tremors shook his body, spasms that tore muscles from bone. Bouts of vertigo seized him, sending the damp, ancient corridors spinning around him. And most terrifyingly, there were the instantaneous partial transformations. His claws, usually hidden, involuntarily ripped through the skin of his fingertips, leaving deep, bleeding gashes. His eyes, for fleeting, agonizing moments, shifted from their human brown to a feral, golden amber, catching the faint light like a predator's. He felt the fine hairs on his skin bristling, the muscles in his jaw clenching, the sharp, wolfish teeth attempting to erupt. He was losing control over his own flesh, his own form, his own fragile humanity. In one particularly harrowing moment, as the relentless thudding from the marauders above shook the very rock around him, a dark, insidious thought surfaced, one that almost made him drop to his knees. What if the monsters did have a right to freedom? What if humanity, in its blind ignorance, its arrogant belief in its own dominion over the natural and unnatural worlds, deserved to face this truth? To be confronted with the sheer, unbridled horror that lurked just beneath the veneer of its comfortable civilization? To finally understand its own pathetic fragility in the face of true, primordial terror? For a split second he almost yielded to the thought, almost allowed the beast to take full, untrammeled control, to join the rising tide of monstrous fury. But then, with a desperate, guttural gasp, he recoiled from it, recoiled from the ultimate betrayal, the final surrender. Not yet. Not while there was still breath in his body, still a shred of human will. His mind, frayed and bleeding, pushed to the absolute limits of endurance, was now so thoroughly exhausted, so battered by the constant psychic and physical assault, that he missed a critical, devastating detail. While he wrestled with his internal demons, while he frantically shored up defenses and prepared for a frontal assault, the marauders, less concerned with direct confrontation and more with circumventing obstacles, had discovered something else. An old, badly camouflaged ventilation shaft concealed behind a collapsed section of industrial piping, long forgotten even by the Council's ancient maps. It was small, tight, but wide enough for a determined man to squeeze through. And it led not into a trapped chamber, not into a mind passage, but directly, horribly, into the deepest, most secure levels of the dungeon, bypassing all of Elias's elaborate traps and choke points. A backdoor to hell. The air in the labyrinthine passages of the dungeon turned thick, not just with dampness and the pervasive stench of age and rot, but with a sudden suffocating cloud of dust. The marauders, utilizing every scrap of their stolen explosives and the powerful hydraulic equipment they had hauled into the complex, had finally, horrifyingly, breached a significant section of the ancient gates. The initial boom of the final charge was followed by a protracted, grinding roar as the stone, impossibly old and impossibly dense, finally succumbed. A deep guttural groan as the mountain itself screamed echoed through the vast, dark spaces. Then, with a deafening, earth-shaking crumph, the first monolith, a block of gray stone easily the size of a small truck, tore free from its ancient moorings and crashed into the depths, sending a fresh wave of dust and shattered rock billowing through the newly opened breach. Blinded by the powerful beams of their tactical flashlights, cutting through the swirling dust like alien searchlights, the marauders stumbled, cursing, into the first chambers of the dungeon. Their eager shouts, their grunts of anticipation, died in their throats, choked by a sudden, profound terror. There was no gold here, no glimmer of priceless jewels. Instead, their beams illuminated a scene of unimaginable horror. Ancient, brittle bones, impossibly large and grotesquely shaped, strewn across the damp floor, partially dissolved by time and something far more corrosive. Viscous, shimmering slime coated the rough-hewn walls, glistening with an unnatural light. And everywhere, carved into the stone with a chilling precision, were the same unholy, non-Euclidean hieroglyphs, twisting and shifting in their peripheral vision, revealing madness and things that defied comprehension. Their initial rapacious greed, the hunger for fabled riches, withered and died, replaced instantly by a choking, visceral wave of pure, unadulterated panic. The very instant the ancient gates gave way, the moment that first monolithic block crashed to the floor, the entire dungeon exploded. It was not just a roar anymore. It was an apocalyptic, triumphant, deafening chorus of released terror. Every creature within, sensing the open pathway, the delicious scent of freedom and fresh blood, joined in a unified, ear-splitting shriek of victory. It was a wave of pure animalistic jubilation, so potent, so overwhelming, that it did not just assault Elias's ears. It slammed into his very bones, vibrating through his teeth, tearing his mind from his body. It was a sound that broke whatever remaining tether he had to his human sanity. The marauders, their faces ashen, their eyes wide with uncomprehending horror, finally realized the monumental, unforgivable error they had made. They spun around, desperate to flee. Their greed-fueled bravado evaporated. Someone screamed, a short, choked sound. Another began firing wildly, the sharp crack of his pistol shots echoing uselessly in the vastness, sparking impotently off the ancient stone. But their path to retreat was already cut off. From the now open chambers, from the newly breached cells, from the very shadows that thickened and writhed, the monsters, feeling the intoxicating rush of freedom, began to emerge. Twisted limbs, too many of them, scrabbled against stone. Gleaming eyes, too many of those too, burned in the sudden gloom. Wet, sucking sounds, like enormous leeches detaching from rock, filled the air. In the rapidly escalating chaos, as the first of the creatures, a low-slung, multi-limbed thing that pulsed with sickly green light began to scuttle towards them. One of the marauders, a stocky man with a heavily scarred face, tripped. He was blindly retreating, firing his shotgun over his shoulder, the concussive blasts kicking up fresh dust. As he fell, his flailing hand, in a moment of cosmic, unthinkable irony, struck a precarious stack of rusted metal eye-shaped structural beams and discarded mining equipment that Elias had long ago stacked against a particularly old, unyielding cell wall, a supporting buttress for one of the most ancient and most formidable of the dungeon's containment cells. The stack wobbled, groaned, and then, with a final screeching cacophony of tearing metal, it gave way, toppling with thunderous impact. It struck something else, a thick, corroded lever, an ancient, almost forgotten mechanism that served as a key lock and a crucial structural support for that impossibly strong cell. The massive, ancient cell, now devoid of its critical support, groaned like a dying beast. Deep, spiderweb cracks, wide enough to thrust a fist through, spiderwebbed across its megalithic stone blocks. The impossibly thick bars which had held for millennia began to bend, to warp, to tear away from their very anchors. And then, with a sound like 1,000 tortured souls screaming, the cell deformed, ripping open like a festering wound in the earth itself. The creature within, one of Elias's most enduring, most sickening nightmares, a shadow he had only ever glimpsed in the deepest, most terrifying moments of his patrols, began to emerge. Its truly horrifying form, a writhing mass of chitin and pulsing organs, slowly, inexorably, manifested from the impenetrable darkness within. The sight, the reality of that thing, free and unleashed, combined with the overwhelming clamor and the tangible, reeking horror of the breached dungeon, was the final, crushing blow to Elias's control. He saw it, not just a threat to himself, but a direct, immediate existential threat to the entire world, to every man, woman, and child who slept unsuspecting under the distant stars. His human mind, already tattered and bleeding, gave way completely. His transformation, usually a protracted, agonizing battle, became instantaneous. A searing, blinding agony of bone and muscle and sinew reshaping itself. There was no holding back, no clinging to the human anymore. He was pure beast, a primal force of destruction, driven by one singular overriding instinct: to protect. The thing that slithered forth from the ruptured cell was a nightmare-given substance, a blasphemous mockery of natural life. Its form was a grotesque, shifting mosaic of chitinous plates, slimy membranes, and bone-white protrusions. Limbs, too many to count, too long and too slender, jointed at impossible angles, scrabbled against the wet stone. Its head was a bulbous, featureless mass, but from its underside a maw opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that gleamed in the ambient light. Pulsating organs, a sickly chartreuse in color, throbbed just beneath its translucent skin, visible proof of a corrupted biology. It did not just move, it flowed, a liquid horror, its entire mass rippling as it pulled itself free. Its first action was swift, brutal, and sickeningly efficient. One of the marauders, still screaming, still firing his pistol uselessly into the encroaching shadows, stumbled backwards into its path. There was a wet, tearing sound, a strangled gurgle, and then silence. The marauder was simply gone, absorbed, leaving behind only a crimson splash on the ancient stone and the lingering smell of hot blood and human terror. The rest of the trespassers, paralyzed by a horror that transcended their criminal past, offered little resistance. They were systematically, mercilessly, and efficiently dispatched, their screams echoing briefly before being swallowed by the vast, hungry darkness of the dungeon. This was no Hollywood monster, no slow-moving slasher. This was something ancient, something intelligent, something that moved with an alien grace and demonstrated a terrifying, unprecedented cruelty and strength. The last of their cries faded, leaving only the wet, sucking sounds of the creature's feeding. Elias, now fully in his beast form, was no longer a man. His human mind, once a desperate anchor, was utterly suppressed, a silent scream buried beneath layers of primal fury. He was pure destructive force, a perfectly honed machine of instinct and violence. His senses, sharpened to an impossible degree, registered only the call to battle, the coppery, intoxicating scent of fresh blood, and the overwhelming, undeniable need to protect the fragile world above from the horror that had just been unleashed. His fur bristled, his claws extended, his fangs ached with the urge to rend and tear. The internal noise that suppressed the creatures was gone, replaced by a pure animalistic roar that tore from his throat, a challenge and a promise. The newly released monster, momentarily sated, its form still pulsing with an unholy light, turned its attention to Elias. There was no fear in its alien gaze, no recognition of a common enemy, no hint of a shared purpose. It saw him not as a former man, not as a guardian, but as a rival, another apex predator, a creature that dared to stand in its path, another thing capable of posing a challenge to its newly acquired freedom. Its multiple eyes, pinpricks of malevolent light, fixed on Elias, a cold, calculating intelligence gleaming within their depths. And then they clashed. It was not just a fight. It was an epic, non-human battle, a primal dance of tooth and claw, of raw, unrestrained fury against unimaginable alien power. Claws met Chitine with a shriek of scraping metal. Fangs snapped against bone plates with a sickening crack. Rage fueled by duty slammed against rage fueled by ancient hunger. The sounds that filled the dungeon were beyond description. The tearing of rusted metal, wrenched from ancient fixtures, the cracking of impossibly thick bones, the groaning and pulverizing of crumbling stone. It was a symphony of destruction, a testament to the sheer, unbridled power of two monstrous entities locked in a fight to the death. The clash of the two monsters, their raw power unleashed, inflicted colossal damage on the dungeon itself. Each impact, each shattering blow sent shock waves through the ancient structure. Walls, which had stood for millennia, now groaned and split, showering the floor with ancient dust and rock shards. The thick megalithic supports, painstakingly placed by unknown hands in a forgotten era, shuddered and began to crack under the strain, their ancient strength finally giving way. And as the structural integrity of the main prison crumbled, a terrible chain reaction became inevitable. Other cells, weakened by the general instability, by the vibrations of the battle, began to show critical cracks. Elias heard the sounds from within them growing louder, more frantic, more desperate. He was fighting to save the world, but in doing so he was shattering the very prison he had guarded. In the brutal, mind-numbing fervor of the battle, amidst the guttural snarls and the sickening wet thuds, Elias, even in his fully transformed state, caught something. A flicker. In the monstrous creature's multiple pinprick eyes, amidst the pure, unadulterated animalistic malice, he saw something more. A brief, chilling flash of recognition, a glint of desperation, and a profoundly painful, horribly twisted logic. It was not just a mindless beast. It was something else. Something more. Something he had not yet been able to comprehend. The brutal, non-human battle raged beyond the confines of the single breached cell. Elias, a whirlwind of muscle and instinct, and the monstrous entity, a flowing horror of chitin and bone, pursued each other through the labyrinthine corridors of the ancient dungeon. The complex became their battleground, its narrow passages and cavernous chambers a deadly arena. Elias, even in his primal beast form, used his intimate knowledge of the place, every hidden alcove, every precarious ledge, every blind corner to his advantage, maneuvering with a cunning born of both instinct and his long-buried military training. The creature, however, countered with its own terrifying, unique abilities, proving itself to be far more than just a brute force of nature. It moved with a horrifying fluidity, capable of partially phasing through the ancient stone walls, its viscous form rippling as it melted into the rock only to reappear seconds later from another angle. From its pulsing skin, it launched volleys of razor-sharp, poisonous bone spikes that hissed through the air, embedding themselves in the stone with sickening thuds. And most terrifyingly, it possessed an inhuman regeneration. Wounds that incapacitated any lesser creature, gouges that laid bare bone and muscle, slowly, agonizingly knit themselves back together, its pulsating organs visibly reforming beneath its translucent skin. This combination of speed, unique attack, and impossible resilience made it a truly formidable, almost unbeatable adversary. But Elias, even with his human consciousness buried beneath layers of primal rage, was not merely an animal. The years of special forces training, the brutal lessons learned in a dozen forgotten sand-choked hellholes, now surfaced through the beast. He did not just fight blindly, lashing out with tooth and claw. He sought vulnerabilities, analyzing the creature's movements, its patterns of attack. He used the crumbling environment itself as a weapon, collapsing sections of ceiling, kicking unstable supports, funneling the creature into choke points where its abilities were diminished. He employed cunning, feigning retreat only to unleash a devastating counterattack, using his superior strength and knowledge of the dungeon's layout to gain a fleeting advantage. This was a monster, yes, but a monster fighting with the cunning of a seasoned warrior. During the brutal, relentless exchange of blows, as his own blood, hot and metallic, mingled with the creature's sickly green ichor, Elias felt something even more terrifying happening within him. His own consciousness, the last fragile vestiges of his human self, merged not just with the raw animalistic fury of his own beast form, but with the alien ancient rage of the monster he fought. The boundaries between them, once distinct, were blurring, dissolving into a shared, consuming madness. He was fighting it, but he was also fighting himself, wrestling with the creeping certainty that his true enemy was not external, but internal. A mirror held up to his own terrifying future. Both combatants suffered horrific wounds. Elias's transformed hide was a mass of deep gashes, his fur matted with his own dark blood. He felt bones aching, cracked, beneath the tearing force of the monster's attacks. The monster, for its part, was a ruin of its former self, its chitinous plates fractured, its pulsating organs partially exposed, its viscous fluids oozing onto the damp stone. Every strike was a last-ditch effort, every movement fueled by a desperate, agonizing exhaustion. This was a battle for survival, a bloody, protracted dance that ended only when one or both of them expended every last drop of strength, every last ounce of their terrible, destructive power. And with every crushing blow, every earth-shaking impact, every guttural roar from the two titans, the remaining fortifications of the dungeon weakened further. The sound of crumbling stone and groaning metal was almost constant now. More cells, their ancient integrity finally compromised, began to give way, their thick stone walls cracking, their rusted bars bending outwards. Elias heard it even through the roar of his own blood in his ears. The frenzied scrabbling, the wet slithering, the triumphant, hungry sounds of the other creatures stirring, sensing the death of one of their kind, feeling the possibility of their own liberation. Time was running out, not just for him, but for the entire unsuspecting world above. Elias saw it. A momentary hesitation in the monster's relentless assault, a brief, fleeting vulnerability as its regeneration faltered, its multi-limbed body momentarily slowing. It was a breach, a tiny, almost imperceptible chink in its horrifying armor. With a final desperate surge of strength, summoning every ounce of his remaining fury, Elias lunged. He tore into the creature, burying his fangs deep into its vulnerable, pulsating core, driving his claws into the fissure he had found. With a shriek that ripped through the very fabric of the dungeon, he delivered the decisive, mortal blow, pinning the writhing, dying monstrosity to the crumbling ground. The monstrous entity, its impossible form, now a mangled ruin of chitin and exposed organs, writhed in violent, convulsive spasms on the damp stone floor. Its multi-limbed body thrashed, spraying sickly green ichor, its myriad eyes blinking rapidly, then slowly, one by one, losing their unholy light. The grotesque movement slowed, became less frantic, until finally, with a soft, wet sigh, it stilled. Its horrifying alien form, once a pulsating testament to a primordial nightmare, began to slowly, visibly distort and warp. Faded, leaving only a dull, dead gray. And in its dying, fading eyes, a chilling clarity, a spark of something almost comprehensible appeared, piercing the veil of its monstrous visage. And then, from its gurgling maw, a sound emerged. Not the chittering or the roaring Elias had grown accustomed to, but something else entirely. Inarticulate, fragmented, yet chillingly, undeniably human words. They were raw, scraped from a throat not meant for human speech, but the meaning was clear. A horrifying whisper that froze Elias's blood and shattered the last vestiges of his beast-driven fury. "Don't fight the call," the dying thing rasped, its voice a wet, rattling croak. "We are the fallen. Now your turn. Guardian." The word, ancient and familiar, echoed in Elias's mind, cutting through the haze of battle-induced madness. As the last syllable faded, the monster's form underwent a final, sickening transformation. The alien flesh melted away, collapsing in on itself, revealing not the expected emptiness, but something far more terrible. Beneath the dissolving chitin, there were the gruesome, unmistakable remains of a human body. A tattered skeletal hand, its skin long gone, its bones brittle with age. Fragments of what was once fabric, rotted and clinging to bone. And then, catching the faint ambient light, a glint of dull gold on a bony finger, a wedding band, simple and unadorned. It was not just a monster. It was a man. It had been a man. The dying monster's words, combined with the horrifying revelation of its true nature, slammed into Elias's consciousness with the force of a 1,000-pound hammer. The truth, raw and unforgiving, was laid bare. This creature, this unspeakable nightmare, was not some ancient demon, some entity from beyond the stars. It was a guardian, just like Elias. It had been chosen and cursed, just like him. It had stood watch for centuries in this very dungeon. But it had fallen. It had succumbed to the influence, to the curse, to the terrible, relentless call from the depths. And it had become one of the prisoners, one of the unspeakable things it was sworn to contain. The realization was a cold, iron claw clenching around Elias's heart. The creatures within these cells were not demons. They were his predecessors. Elias's mind reeled, every fiber of his being rejecting, then grasping the monstrous truth. This entire time he had believed he was guarding the world from ancient evils, from malevolent forces of primordial darkness. But that was a lie. A brutal, agonizing cosmic joke. These creatures, this entire prison, was not a dungeon for hellish abominations. It was a graveyard, a mausoleum of fallen guardians, a terrible silent testament to those who had tried and failed to bear the unbearable burden. They had been absorbed by the darkness, consumed by the very things they were meant to guard, transformed into the very nightmares they were meant to imprison. And this was his fate. In the dying monster, its skeletal hand reaching out, its golden band a stark, chilling emblem of a life once lived, Elias saw his own inevitable future. The horror that had driven him, the terror he had fought so desperately to contain, had not come from some external invading force. It came from within. It was born of understanding. His destiny was not to defeat the darkness, but to become a part of it, to be another link in the chain of despair. The last flicker of alien light died in the monster's eyes. Its mangled form settled, a heap of rotting chitin and bone, mercifully still. In the vast, echoing silence of the dungeon, a silence that now felt infinitely more profound, infinitely more terrifying than any scream, only two sounds remained. The low, mournful groaning of the ancient walls, stressed beyond endurance, and the unsettling rhythmic crackle of crumbling supports, a sound that spoke of imminent collapse. Elias Vance stood alone in the absolute darkness, his monstrous form a stark silhouette, utterly alone with this horrifying, universe-altering truth. The truth, revealed by the dying breath of the creature he had just slain, settled over Elias like a shroud woven from lead and despair. Every battle fought, every night spent in agony, every shred of sanity he had sacrificed, it was all a monstrous lie. His life, his purpose, his agonizing, self-inflicted exile, his duty, his very existence as a guardian, it was all a cosmic deception. He had not been guarding the world from ancient, malevolent entities. He had been guarding his own reflection, a terrifying prophecy of what he was destined to become. The creatures, the things that thrashed and gnashed within the stone cells, were not invading horrors. They were his predecessors, his brethren, his doom. The revelation twisted his inner beast, the primal force that had just fought so ferociously against the newly freed horror. Before, his animal side had struggled against the maddening call from the depths, recognizing them as an enemy, a primal threat. Now, that struggle died, replaced by a horrifying, undeniable kinship. It recognized them. It felt a terrifying, visceral connection. They were not enemies. They were family. Twisted, corrupted, monstrous, yes, but family nonetheless. His blood, the very source of his curse and his power, recognized its own, and it yearned to join them. The human part of Elias, what little remained after years of torment and the brutal recent onslaught, shattered. It was not just broken, it was pulverized, reduced to dust. He was adrift in an ocean of profound, crushing loneliness, his sacrifice rendered utterly meaningless. All the pain, all the loss, all the vigilance, all the suffering, it had been for nothing. He had fought a phantom war, a battle against himself, a battle he had lost before he had even entered the fray. He understood it now, with a clarity that stung worse than any wound. His fate was not to escape, but to join them. He had been defeated the moment he inherited the curse, the moment the bloodline claimed him. The damage from the brutal, world-shaking battle he had just fought was now beyond critical. The dungeon, once an impenetrable fortress, was a ruin. The groaning of the walls had become a constant, terrifying thrum. More and more cells, their ancient integrity completely compromised, were now on the very brink of destruction. Elias heard it, the frantic scrabbling, the low, guttural moans, the wet, sucking sounds of the other guardians within, sensing the death of one of their own, sensing the weakening of their prison, sensing the intoxicating possibility of their own liberation. A cacophony of monstrous hunger and desperate hope rose from the depths, a new terrible symphony of impending freedom. He was running out of time. Then, faint, almost imperceptible against the groaning of the dungeon, he heard it. A sound from the surface. Distant, muffled, but undeniably human. The faint thrum of a helicopter. The distant shouts of men. The familiar, but now alien, scent of gasoline and human sweat carried on the subterranean currents. Another group of marauders. A rescue team, following the trail of the first. A last, desperate attempt by the outside world to reclaim what it indeed lost. It was a fleeting, agonizing reminder of the world he had once belonged to, the world he had sworn to protect, the world that was now completely, utterly lost to him. Before him lay the ultimate dilemma, stark and unforgiving, illuminated by the dying embers of his humanity. He had choices. He could leave. He could turn his back on the collapsing prison, on the impending deluge of horror. He could simply walk away, allow the monsters to break free, allow them to swarm onto the unsuspecting surface, consuming everything in their path. He could choose his own freedom at the expense of the entire world. But he questioned the true price of such freedom. He knew what would be left of him, of his conscience, of the man he had once been, if he allowed such a horror to escape. He knew he could not live with that. The beast within him could not live with that. He was the last barrier. Not just a physical one, a single battered body standing between the abyss and civilization. He was the last moral barrier, the final bastion of human will, however broken, however frayed, against the tide of primordial despair. He understood that if he left, if he chose his own selfish escape, no one remained to hold the line. No one bore the burden. No one carried the curse. The decision, when it finally solidified in Elias's mind, was not a moment of heroic epiphany, no grand gesture of self-sacrifice. It was something far more bleak, far more crushing. It was a choice born of harsh, absolute necessity, a terrible resignation to an inescapable fate. It was the deepest, most agonizing act of self-immolation a man made. He would not escape. He would not allow them to escape. He would lock himself away forever. Summoning the last desperate reserves of his strength, his body aching and bleeding, his mind a fractured landscape of despair, Elias moved through the groaning, collapsing dungeon. He knew its every secret, every hidden passage, every ancient mechanism. With a primal roar, he plunged his transformed claws into a fissure in the rock, twisting, tearing, activating an ancient, nearly forgotten mechanism that had lain dormant for millennia. It was a system designed not for containment, but for destruction, a fail-safe of unimaginable power. He felt the grinding of colossal gears, the shuddering of unseen counterweights, the deep, resonating hum of the mountain itself preparing to devour its own depths. With a final, terrible act of will, Elias triggered a series of targeted collapses. The sounds that followed were apocalyptic, a deafening, rolling thunder as tons of stone tore free from the ceiling, pulverizing everything in its path. The screech of tearing metal, ancient supports buckling and snapping like dry twigs. The sickening crunch of bone, as untold numbers of his monstrous brethren were caught in the cataclysm, their cries of liberation turning to choked screams of final, crushing despair. He heard them, buried alive, condemned to an eternal sleep. And above them, Elias ensured that the surface world never knew. The main entrance, the ventilation shaft, every possible exit was sealed, buried under an impossible weight of rock and earth. The sounds of destruction slowly faded, replaced by an absolute suffocating silence. It was final, irreversible. The dungeon was sealed, and he was trapped within it. With his decision made, the external world severed, and his fate irrevocably sealed, Elias released the last, fragile grip on his humanity. He allowed his body to fully embrace its beast form, not for battle, not for flight, but for eternity. The human part of his mind, the consciousness of Elias Vance, the soldier, the man who had loved and lost, did not die. It simply retreated, withdrawing into the deepest recesses of the monstrous form, becoming a silent, tormented prisoner within the very beast it had fought so desperately to contain. He had voluntarily become one of them, had embraced the final, terrible transformation. But in doing so, he had become their jailer, forever bound to his duty. He continued his patrols, a solitary, monstrous figure in the eternal gloom of the shattered dungeon. But now, his silent, deliberate rounds were conducted not among his prisoners, but among his brothers, the fallen guardians who now writhed and moaned in their eternal cells, the very beings he was condemned to become. He was a silent, tormented sentinel in his own self-made prison, forever on both sides of the bars, both monster and man, both captive and jailer. On the surface, life went on in blissful, profound ignorance. A short, forgettable blurb in the regional newspapers reported on a missing group of adventurers, their disappearance attributed to the treacherous Appalachian terrain and the dangers of abandoned mine shafts. The overgrown, forgotten industrial complex, now swallowed even deeper by the untamed forest, was finally and forever reclaimed by nature. No one ever knew the truth. No one ever did. The true horror of Elias's fate was not death, but his endless, conscious confinement. As the years stretched into centuries, as the memories of the outside world faded like distant echoes, he slowly, inexorably succumbed to the very primal instincts he had so desperately fought to suppress. He became, with every passing century, a more complete version of the thing he had guarded, a terrifying evolution of the curse he had inherited. The final image, etched into the very stone of the mountain, was of Elias Vance, the eternal guardian. A monstrous figure, barely recognizable as human, his eyes glowing with an ancient, tormented intelligence, forever bound to his unspeakable duty in the crushing eternal darkness. He was a living monument to humanity's profound ignorance, a terrifying, silent sentinel, and the terrible price of its precarious, fragile safety.